The son, with an empty gaze that mirrored the barrenness of his soul, watched his mother's frail figure. She lay there, a heap of bones and skin, already bleeding from a cut on her forehead and with an exposed wound on her leg, perhaps the result of a recent fall or the sheer fragility of time. He did not touch her. He didn't need to. The dirt road, dusty and desolate, would be her tomb. Nature will take care of it, he thought, the phrase echoing in his mind like a cold, convenient mantra. He turned his back, the sound of the car engine fading, swallowing the last vestiges of humanity. The mother, already unconscious, lay inert, life slowly draining away under the merciless sun. But fate at times weaves unexpected plots. Hours later, an imposing, furry shadow emerged from the woods. A giant grizzly bear, with eyes that carried the ancient wisdom of the forest, sniffed the air. It approached the woman, not with the ferocity of a predator, but with an almost tender curiosity. With its rough tongue, it began to lick her open wounds, cleaning them with instinctive care. Then it lay down beside her, its massive, warm body forming a barrier against the cold that was beginning to set in, a silent and powerful sentinel, the very essence of the nature the sun expected to devour her, now becoming her guardian. Night descended upon the dirt road like a heavy, icy cloak, but for the unconscious woman, the cold was a distant intruder, muffled by an unexpected presence. The grizzly bear, a colossus of muscle and fur, remained vigilant. Its eyes, once curious, now gleamed with a protective intensity, sweeping the darkness that swallowed the surrounding forest. Every rustle of leaves, every branch broken by the wind, was an alert to its keen senses. It was the very personification of wild nature, and that night, the sentinel of a life that humanity had discarded. Slowly, like the mist dissipating at dawn, consciousness began to return to the woman. First, there was a sensation of warmth, a warmth that didn't come from the merciless sun, but from something massive and alive beside her. Then, the pain. A searing wave in her forehead, a constant throb in her leg, and a thirst that scratched at her throat. She moaned, a weak sound that barely broke the night's silence. Her eyes opened heavy and blurred, and what she saw made her doubt her own sanity. A dark, furry mass, a strong smell of earth and animal. And then, the muzzle. Giant, damp, with warm, heavy breath. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum in her chest, fear, pure and primitive. She was at the mercy of a beast. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond, paralyzed by pain and terror. The bear, sensing the movement, slightly raised its head, its eyes fixed on hers. There was no ferocity, only a strange calm, a depth that seemed to transcend mere animality. It let out a low growl, almost a purr, and with a gentle movement licked the cut on her forehead again. The rough tongue, which had seemed a threat before, now brought a sensation of cleansing, a strange anesthesia. The woman, in her confusion and weakness, began to process the impossible. The bear wasn't attacking her. It was caring for her. Her mind, still hazy, struggled to reconcile the image of the predator with that of the protector. The memory of her son, cold and sharp as a blade, pierced through the haze. The empty gaze, the unspoken words, the sound of the engine fading away. The betrayal, the pain of the wound in her soul was deeper than any cut on her body. He, her own flesh and blood, had abandoned her to die. And now, a wild animal, the symbol of untamed nature, was by her side. The irony was cruel, but the reality even more unbelievable. The bear, as if sensing the tremor in her small body, snuggled closer, its warmth radiating to her. The weight of its forepaw rested gently near her shoulder, a strange anchor. She could feel the slow, powerful rhythm of its breathing. There was no more room for fear. Exhaustion and pain were overwhelming. but a faint flame of hope, or perhaps just disbelief, ignited within her. Night deepened. The distant howl of a coyote cut through the silence, and the bear immediately raised its head, a low, guttural growl emerging from its throat. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed in the direction of the sound. It was a warning, a declaration of possession. The woman, watching the scene, felt a shiver, but not from fear of the bear. It was a shiver of recognition. It was protecting her. Hours dragged on, marked only by the movement of the stars in the sky and the sounds of the nocturnal forest. The woman, still too weak to move, watched the bear. It was a wall against the world, an unlikely guardian. She thought of her life, the sacrifices, the joys and sorrows. She thought of the son she had raised, the love she had given, and now she lay there, on the brink of death, with the sole company of a bear. The pre-dawn chill began to intensify, but the bear's warmth was constant, a living furnace. She closed her eyes, no longer in despair, but with a strange sense of peace. The pain was still there, but the loneliness, the crushing solitude that her son's abandonment had left, seemed to have been filled by this wild and unexpected presence. What the day would bring, she didn't know. But for that night, nature in its most primordial form had chosen not to devour her, but to embrace her. The sun would soon peek over the horizon, and with it, the light would reveal the truth of her situation, and perhaps the truth about what it means to be cared for. Tension hung in the air, as thick as the morning dew, promising that the journey was only just beginning, and that the line between life and death, between humanity and savagery, was thinner than she had ever imagined. The veil of night began to tear, not with a violent rip, but with the delicacy of a sigh. First, a pale grey painted the horizon, dissipating the deepest shadows. Then shades of pink and orange began to peek through, tinting the clouds and relentlessly revealing the scene on the dirt road. The arriving light was not a gentle embrace, but a raw exposure, stripping bare the truth of that dawn. The woman, still nestled against the bear's warm flank, felt the change in the atmosphere. Her eyes opened slowly, her vision still blurred by exhaustion and pain. What had once been a dark, comforting mass now revealed itself in striking detail. The bear's fur, a tapestry of brown and golden hues, gleamed under the rising light. Its massive head rested on its forepaws, eyes half closed, yet still vigilant. It was a colossus of flesh and bone, a predator in its purest state, and yet her guardian. The pain, which the night had muffled with the fog of unconsciousness, now manifested with brutal clarity. Her forehead throbbed, her leg pulsed with a dull, constant ache, and her throat was so dry it felt like sandpaper with every attempt to swallow. Thirst was a torment that surpassed physical pain, a primal need screaming in every fiber of her being. She tried to move just an inch, but her body protested. Every muscle felt as if it had turned to lead. The bear, sensing the slight stir, raised its head. Its deep brown eyes met hers. There was no threat, only a calm, almost questioning observation. It let out a low growl, a sound that strangely didn't frighten her. It was a sound of recognition, of presence. The sunlight, now stronger, bathed the dirt road, revealing the dust, the loose stones, and the desolate vastness that surrounded her. There were no signs of human life, no car, no house, just the dense, impenetrable forest on one side and the abyss of a valley on the other. The reality of her abandonment solidified with the clarity of day. Her son, her own flesh and blood, had left her there to be swallowed by nature. And nature, in a way that defied all logic, had sent one of its most powerful children to protect her. The irony was a blow stronger than any wound. A mother's love, unconditional and eternal, had been repaid with the coldest of betrayals. And now a wild animal, with no blood ties, no memory of a shared past, offered what her own son had denied: care, warmth, and a strange form of loyalty. A solitary tear escaped the corner of her eye, tracing a path through the dust and grime on her face. It wasn't a tear of despair, but of a deep and bitter understanding. What was humanity, after all? Where was the line separating civility from savagery? In that moment, under the watchful eye of a bear, the line seemed to have completely dissolved. The bear, as if sensing the turmoil in her soul, moved slightly, its muzzle brushing her shoulder. The smell of earth, of forest, of wild animal was strong, but no longer repulsive. It was the smell of her salvation. It licked her again, this time on her hand, a gesture that felt more like a caress than a cleaning. The rough yet gentle tongue brought a strange sense of comfort. Hunger and thirst were urgent, but how could she move? How could she find water? The forest, which had once seemed a refuge, now revealed itself as a labyrinth of dangers and challenges. The sun climbed higher, and with it the heat began to press down. The dirt road, which had seemed a tomb at night, now transformed into an oven. Exposure was a new enemy. The bear, sensing the rising temperature, let out a snort. It stood up, its massive body casting a protective shadow over her. With a movement surprising for its size, it began to dig the ground with its forepaws, not far from her, but enough to create a small depression in the earth, a place where the shadow could extend a little further. It was an instinct, a primordial intelligence that left her speechless. It wasn't just protecting her from nocturnal predators, but also from the merciless elements of the day. The woman watched, fascinated and terrified, as the bear worked. It was the very personification of nature, and it was acting to keep her alive. The tension, which the night had woven with the fear of the unknown, now transformed into a struggle for survival under the sun. She was wounded, weak, and completely dependent on a bear. What would the day bring? More heat, more thirst, more pain? Or would it bring a chance, however unlikely, to continue living, guided by this improbable guardian? The journey was only just beginning, and the line between life and death, between humanity and savagery, seemed to narrow with each beat of her weak heart. Loose earth flew, propelled by the bear's powerful claws as it worked with silent determination. The woman watched, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and faint hope. The hole it dug wasn't deep, but enough to create a depression, a small refuge where the forest's shadow, still scarce, could extend a little further. It was an act of primordial intelligence, a survival instinct that included her. When it finally stopped, letting out a contented snort, the woman felt a minimal but palpable relief from the sun's increasing intensity. But the relief was fleeting. The pain, which the night had disguised with the fog of unconsciousness, now manifested with brutal clarity under the relentless daylight. Her forehead throbbed, her leg pulsed with a dull, constant ache, and her throat was so dry it felt like sandpaper with every attempt to swallow. Thirst was a torment that surpassed physical pain, a primal need screaming in every fiber of her being. Her lips were cracked, her tongue rough as sandpaper. She tried to move just an inch, but her body protested. Every muscle felt as if it had turned to lead, every joint a needle. The bear, sensing the slight stir, raised its head. Its deep brown eyes met hers. There was no threat, only a calm, almost questioning observation. It let out a low growl, a sound that strangely didn't frighten her. It was a sound of recognition, of presence. The sunlight, now stronger, bathed the dirt road, revealing the dust, the loose stones, and the desolate vastness that surrounded her. There were no signs of human life, no car, no house, just the dense, impenetrable forest on one side, and the abyss of a valley on the other. The reality of her abandonment solidified with the clarity of day. Her son, her own flesh and blood, had left her there to be swallowed by nature. And nature, in a way that defied all logic, had sent one of its most powerful children to protect her. The irony was a blow stronger than any wound. A mother's love, unconditional and eternal, had been repaid with the coldest of betrayals. And now, a wild animal with no blood ties, no memory of a shared past, offered what her own son had denied: care, warmth, and a strange form of loyalty. Hunger and thirst were urgent, but how could she move? How could she find water? The forest, which had once seemed a refuge, now revealed itself as a labyrinth of dangers and challenges. The sun climbed higher, and with it the heat began to press down. The dirt road, which had seemed a tomb at night, now transformed into an oven. Exposure was a new enemy. The bear, sensing the rising temperature and perhaps the woman's silent agony, let out a low growl and stood up. Its massive body cast an imposing shadow over her. It sniffed the air, its muscles tense, and then, with a surprising movement, began to move away, walking slowly towards the dense forest, but not without first casting a glance back, as if inviting her to follow. Panic seized her. Was her guardian leaving? She tried to scream, but only a hoarse whisper escaped her dry throat. "No, please!" The bear stopped, turned its head, and let out a softer sound, almost a murmur, before continuing its path, disappearing among the trees. The woman was alone again, the bear's shadow dissipating, the sun punishing her. The fear, which had been muffled by the beast's presence, returned with full force. She was unprotected, at the mercy of the elements and any predator that might emerge. Her son's betrayal echoed in her mind, and now nature seemed to be completing the work. But then a distant sound, a rustle of leaves, a fresh, damp smell. The bear reappeared at the edge of the forest, not alone. In its mouth it carried something, a thick branch covered in moss and dew, from which water dripped. It approached cautiously, depositing the branch a few inches from her head. Water trickled in small drops, forming a tiny puddle on the earth. It was little, barely enough to moisten her lips, but it was a promise of life. The woman, with superhuman effort, stretched out her trembling hand, scratching the earth to reach the moisture. Every movement was torture, but thirst was stronger. She licked the wet earth, tasting minerals and life. The bear watched her, its eyes fixed, as if it understood the depth of her need. It lay down again, its presence an anchor, while the woman, in small, painful sips, tried to absorb the little water the branch offered. The tension, which the night had woven with the fear of the unknown, now transformed into a struggle for survival under the sun. Guided by this improbable guardian, the journey was only just beginning, and the line between life and death, between humanity and savagery, seemed to narrow with each beat of her weak heart. The woman, with a trembling hand, tried to squeeze more moisture from the mossy branch. Every drop was precious, an elixir that barely scratched the surface of her overwhelming thirst. The earthy, mineral taste of the water on the ground, mixed with the damp moss, was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. But it was an ephemeral relief. Her throat still scratched, her mouth was still dry, and the sensation of dehydration persisted, a slow fire consuming her from within. The merciless sun climbed higher, turning the road into an oven and the bear's small shadow into an increasingly insufficient refuge. The bear, lying beside her, seemed to sense the urgency of time and the inadequacy of that palliative. Its brown eyes fixed on her, and then it let out a low growl, a sound that wasn't a threat, but something deeper, almost a communication. It slowly stood up, its massive body casting a momentary shadow over her. The woman watched, her heart pounding, a mixture of fear and strange trust. It wouldn't abandon her. Not now. The bear moved a few steps towards the forest, stopping and looking back, as if expecting her to follow. The message was clear, but the execution impossible. She tried to push herself up, but the pain in her leg was excruciating, a sharp stab that made her gasp. Her muscles, atrophied by inactivity and weakened by hunger, refused to obey. A groan of frustration escaped her cracked lips. The bear, sensing her inability, let out a snort. It returned, approaching her with surprising caution for its size. With its muzzle, it brushed her shoulder, a soft touch, almost an invitation. She felt the warmth of its body, the wild, but now familiar scent. It then positioned itself beside her, lowering itself slightly. It was a gesture that defied all logic, all human understanding of wild beasts. It was offering support. With superhuman effort and adrenaline fueled by hopelessness and a faint glimmer of hope, she tried to crawl. The pain was searing, but the thought of remaining there, at the mercy of the sun and thirst, was even more terrifying. She rested her hand on the bear's thick fur, feeling the strength and solidity of its body. It was rough but warm, an anchor amidst the chaos. The bear began to move slowly, with a patience that seemed infinite. It didn't pull her, nor did it push her forcefully. It simply walked, allowing her to use its body as support, a prop. Every step was agony for the woman. Her injured leg dragged across the loose earth, sharp stones tearing at her already bruised skin. Her forehead throbbed, and her vision blurred with effort and pain, but she refused to give up. The image of her son abandoning her was a bitter fuel that propelled her. If he wanted her dead, she would fight to live, if only to defy his cruelty. The journey along the edge of the forest was slow and arduous. The smell of pine and damp earth replaced the scent of dust and heat. Sunlight filtered through the treetops, creating a mosaic of shadows and light that at times blinded her. Dry leaves and brittle branches crunched under the bear's heavy paws and the painful drag of her body. She could hear the distant murmur of insects, the chirping of birds that seemed to mock her misery. After what felt like an eternity of pain and effort, the sound of running water grew clearer, closer. The bear stopped. Ahead of them, hidden by a curtain of ferns and moss, was a small clearing. In its center, a spring bubbled softly, crystal-clear water trickling between moss-covered stones, forming a small stream that snaked into the forest. The air there was fresher, damper, saturated with the scent of wet earth and lush vegetation. The woman collapsed, not from exhaustion, but from relief. The sight of the water was a balm for her tormented soul. She crawled the last few inches, ignoring the pain, to the edge of the spring. With trembling hands, she plunged her face into the cold water, drinking in large, desperate gulps. The icy liquid flowed down her throat, burning and healing at the same time. It was life, pure and unadulterated. The bear watched, lying a few feet away, its head raised, its eyes fixed. It didn't try to drink, didn't bother her. It simply observed like a silent guardian. In that moment, the line between humanity and savagery had not only dissolved, it had inverted. The animal was the savior, the human, the abandoned. The irony was as deep as the spring water and as bitter as her son's betrayal. She was alive by a miracle and by a bear. The journey hadn't ended, but a new chapter, unthinkable and wild, had begun. The water, that cold, pure liquid, flowed down her parched throat, a balm for the open wound of thirst. Each gulp was a promise, a small miracle that rekindled the flame of life in her dying body. She drank until the pain in her throat subsided, until the dizziness receded slightly, until the taste of earth and moss mingled with the flavor of survival itself. But the relief was only partial. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, an empty void that no water could fill. Her leg throbbed with a constant pulsing ache. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, and exhaustion was a thick fog threatening to swallow her again. The bear, her silent guardian, watched. Its deep, enigmatic brown eyes revealed no judgment, only unwavering attention. It didn't move to drink, didn't rush her. It simply waited, a mountain of fur and muscle that somehow had become her safe harbor. The woman lifted her head from the spring, her face wet, her hair plastered to her forehead. She looked at the bear, and a strange feeling, a mixture of gratitude and perplexity, flooded her being. How was it possible? How could such a wild, feared creature be her only ally? The bear let out a low growl, a guttural sound that resonated in the damp air of the clearing. It rose, majestic in its strength, and with an almost imperceptible nod, began to move away from the spring, venturing deeper into the forest. The message was clear. Water was only the first step. The journey continued. The woman, with a heavy sigh, gathered her last strength. The thought of moving again was excruciating, but the alternative, staying there, exposed, waiting for who knew what, was even worse. She dragged herself out of the spring, cold water trickling down her torn clothes. Every movement was a battle against pain and weakness. The bear waited, stopping every few feet, looking back to ensure she was following. It guided her through the trees, along a path that seemed invisible to human eyes, but that for it was as familiar as the very scent of the forest. The ground was soft, covered by a thick layer of dry leaves and moss, a relief for her bruised feet. The air was fresh, filtered by the dense canopy of trees, and the sound of the stream born from the spring was a constant melody in the background. They walked for a time she couldn't measure, each step an eternity. The forest grew denser, the trees taller, the sunlight a mere glimpse between the leaves. Then the bear stopped. Ahead, hidden by a curtain of vines and thick bushes, was a rock overhang, a small natural cave. It wasn't large, but it offered shelter, darkness, and above all, protection. The bear turned to her, and its eyes seemed to say, "Here, rest." The woman collapsed at the cave's entrance, her body trembling with exhaustion. The ground was packed earth, cool and damp, a welcome contrast to the road's heat. She huddled, feeling the cold rock against her back, but the sense of security was intoxicating. The bear did not enter the cave. It lay down at the entrance, its massive body blocking most of the light, but also serving as an impenetrable barrier. It was the wall, the guardian, the shield. Hunger, which had been momentarily forgotten by thirst and the pain of movement, returned with full force. Her stomach rumbled, a shameful sound in the forest's silence. She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the sensation of emptiness, the weakness spreading through her limbs. The image of her son, eating a sandwich in the car while she bled on the road, came to her mind. The irony was cruel. He, the man, abandoned her to death. The animal, the beast, kept her alive. As the cave's darkness enveloped her and the bear's scent became her new perfume of security, she began to reflect. What was civility, after all? Was it the houses, the cars, the empty words of love and care? Or was it the unconditional loyalty, the instinctive protection, the silent compassion of a creature that knew no human malice? The line separating man from animal, humanity from savagery, had not only dissolved, it had brutally and undeniably inverted. Time passed, marked only by the subtle shift in the light filtering through the cave entrance. She must have dozed off, a light sleep disturbed by pain and anxiety. When she opened her eyes, the bear was still there, an imposing silhouette against the fading light. But something was different. A strong, sweet smell hung in the air. The bear moved slightly, and she saw, at her feet, at the cave entrance, was a pile of wild berries, dark and glistening, and some mushrooms she didn't recognize. It had foraged. Not meat, but what the forest offered most accessibly. It was a gift, an offering of life. The woman stretched out her trembling hand, picking up one of the berries. It was soft, juicy, and the sweet flavor exploded in her mouth, a welcome contrast to the bitterness she felt. She ate slowly, savoring each piece, each drop of juice. The bear watched her, its eyes fixed, as if ensuring she would eat. It ate nothing. Its priority was her. Night began to fall, and with it the sounds of the forest intensified. the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of nocturnal insects. But inside the cave, under the bear's guard, there was a strange peace. The woman, with a slightly less empty stomach, felt a wave of gratitude so profound it almost choked her. She was at the mercy of nature, but nature, in its wildest form, was being her salvation. The journey was far from over, but for now she was safe and alive. A new dawn, if there was one, would be a testament to the most improbable of alliances. The new dawn arrived, not with the golden explosion she knew from open fields, but with a soft, greenish light that filtered through the dense forest leaves. Inside the cave, the night's darkness slowly yielded to a pale grey, revealing the irregular shapes of the rocks and the damp earth floor. The bear's scent, which the night before had been a perfume of security, now mingled with the fresh aroma of wet earth and the sweet mold of vegetation. She opened her eyes, her body stiff and aching, every muscle protesting against the slightest movement. The bear was still there, a dark, imposing mass at the cave entrance, its silhouette blocking the outside world. It didn't sleep, or at least didn't seem to. Its eyes, now more visible in the faint light, were fixed on her, an unwavering vigilance that seemed to transcend mere animal curiosity. Hunger was still an uncomfortable presence, but thirst had diminished, and the sweetness of the wild berries still lingered in her memory. She tried to move, and a sharp stab of pain shot through her injured leg. The makeshift bandage of torn rags was soaked with dried blood and sweat, clinging to her skin. The wound throbbed, hot and pulsing, a constant reminder of the violence that had cast her into this green hell. The sight of her leg was disheartening, swollen, reddish, with exposed flesh in some places. The fear of infection, a silent and relentless enemy, began to gnaw at her courage. She looked at the bear, seeking some sign, some answer. It was brute force, the instinctive wisdom of the forest. It had guided her, fed her, protected her, but could it heal her? Could it fight against something as invisible as disease? The irony of the situation was a slow poison in her veins. Her son, raised with all love and sacrifice, had left her to die. The bear, a wild creature, was fighting to keep her alive. What was civilization after all? A thin shell over barbarity, undone by the first breeze of selfishness. Savagery, on the other hand, seemed to possess a deeper, truer compassion than anything she had known in human society. The bear let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It stood up, stretching its massive body with majestic slowness, and then turned, entering the cave further than it had before. It approached her, its eyes fixed on her injured leg. The woman felt a chill, a mixture of fear and expectation. It lowered itself, and she could feel the warmth of its heavy breath on her skin. It sniffed the wound, a soft rustle of its nose against the soiled bandage. She held her breath, expecting the worst, or perhaps a miracle. Then, it did something unexpected. With its forepaw, it gently, with surprising delicacy for a creature of its size, pushed the torn rags aside, exposing the wound. The woman flinched, the sharp pain reigniting. The bear licked the wound. Its rough, yet strangely soft tongue moved over the torn skin, the warm, thick saliva cleaning the dried blood and dirt. It wasn't an aggressive lick, but a gesture of cleansing, of care. She felt a shiver run through her body, not from fear, but from an emotion so deep and complex it had no name. It was disgust, yes, but also overwhelming gratitude, an acceptance that, in that moment, healing would come in the most improbable way. It licked for a while, with almost surgical concentration, before moving slightly away, looking at her with those deep eyes. The wound, though still open and painful, seemed a little cleaner, a little less inflamed. The bear's saliva, she knew, had antiseptic properties. Nature, in its brutal wisdom, offered its own remedies. The bear then stood up again and with a nod of its head indicated the cave's exit. The message was clear. It was time to move on. The cave was a temporary shelter, but the journey for survival hadn't ended. The woman sighed. The thought of moving again was excruciating, but her trust in the bear, strange as it was, had taken root in her wounded heart. She dragged herself out of the cave, the morning light hitting her eyes. The forest seemed even denser, more mysterious. But now there was a purpose. The bear waited for her, turning to lead the way. It didn't rush her, allowing her to crawl, leaning on trees and exposed roots. With each step, the pain in her leg was a hammer striking her bone, but the image of the bear, her silent guardian, propelled her forward. They moved through the dense vegetation, the bear clearing a path with its massive body, swerving around thorny bushes and low branches. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was constant, and the sound of insects and birds filled the air. Suddenly the bear stopped. It raised its head, sniffing the air, its muscles tense. A low, guttural growl escaped its throat, a sound of warning. The woman felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in the air, something she couldn't see or smell, but which the bear detected with its keen senses. The tension in the forest increased. The silence grew heavier, more menacing. The bear turned to her, its eyes fixed, and then, with a swift movement, it gently pushed her behind a dense bush, hiding her from view. It positioned itself in front, its massive and imposing body, a barrier between her and the invisible danger that approached. The journey was not just about surviving nature, but about surviving in nature, with all its predators and hidden threats. The improbable alliance would be tested again. The air in the forest grew dense, laden with a palpable tension that the woman felt in every fiber of her being. Hidden behind the dense bush, she barely dared to breathe, her heart pounding erratically against her ribs. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves now mingled with a different odor, a wild and pungent aroma she couldn't identify, but which her guardian, the bear, clearly recognized as danger. The bear was motionless, a statue of brute force, its muscles tense beneath its thick fur. Its eyes, once fixed on her, now swept the forest with an intensity that spoke of an ancestral instinct, of wisdom forged in millennia of survival. It no longer growled, no longer moved. It simply waited, a wall of flesh and bone between her and the unknown. The woman closed her eyes for an instant, trying to calm her mind, but the image of her injured leg, throbbing with constant pain, and the fear of infection were cruel reminders of her vulnerability. She was a burden, a weak link in the chain of wildlife. If the bear abandoned her now, it would be the end. The irony was glaring. The animal that had saved her now exposed her to even greater danger simply by its presence. Then, the sound. A rustle of leaves, not the soft whisper of the wind, but the deliberate dragging of something heavy moving through the vegetation. And then a low, guttural growl that made the woman's blood run cold. It wasn't the bear's growl, but something sharper, more predatory. A chill ran down her spine. She opened her eyes, trying to peek through the leaves of the bush, but her vision was limited. The bear reacted. A deep, resonant growl escaped its throat, a warning, a challenge. Its fur bristled, and it leaned slightly forward, its claws partially exposed. The woman then saw, through a gap in the leaves, what had provoked such a reaction. A slender, grey silhouette emerged from the dense foliage, followed by another, and then another. Wolves. 3 of them, with bright, hungry eyes, sniffing the air. They were lean but powerful, with the cold intelligence of predators that hunt in packs. They weren't just interested in the bear. The scent of human blood, fresh and vulnerable, was an irresistible invitation. The bear positioned itself even more firmly, turning slightly to ensure its body completely covered the woman. It was an unshakable fortress. The wolves, in turn, did not approach immediately. They circled, maintaining a respectful distance, assessing their opponent. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to the imminent confrontation. The woman watched, paralyzed by terror, but also by a strange fascination. The dance of life and death unfolded before her in its purest and most brutal form. The bear, her improbable guardian, was about to fight for her, a creature it barely knew, against other predators of its own kind. What drove this loyalty? There was no logic, only instinct, a wild compassion that surpassed any human understanding. One of the wolves, the largest, with a scar over its eye, stepped forward, a low growl vibrating in its chest. The other two followed, flanking it. They were testing the bear, looking for a weakness, an opening. The woman felt cold sweat trickle down her forehead. With each second, the tension mounted, the air growing heavier, almost unbreathable. Suddenly, the bear let out a thunderous roar, a sound that made the earth tremble and birds fly in panic from the trees. It wasn't a roar of blind rage, but a warning, a demonstration of power that echoed through the forest. The wolves recoiled a step, surprised by the ferocity of the display, but they didn't give up. Hunger was a powerful driver. The scarred wolf, with surprising audacity, attempted a swift charge, darting to the bear's side, seeking an opening. But the bear was quick, despite its size. It spun, its claws extended, and the wolf retreated with a frustrated howl, narrowly escaping a devastating blow. The fight wasn't about killing, but about dominating, about establishing who was the alpha predator in that part of the forest. The bear wasn't hunting, it was defending, and the woman was what it defended. The wolves continued to circle, trying to flank, seeking an opportunity. They were persistent, but the bear was unshakable. It moved with surprising grace for its size, always keeping its body between the woman and the threat. Its eyes never lost focus, its attention divided among the three predators. The woman thought of her son, how he had abandoned her without even a backward glance. And there was a wild animal risking its own life for her. The line between human and animal had not only inverted, it had completely disintegrated, revealing the true nature of compassion and cruelty. The battle of wills stretched on for minutes that felt like hours. The wolves, sensing the bear's unyielding determination and the lack of an easy opening, began to show signs of frustration. The scarred wolf, after another frustrated attempt to flank, let out a growl of defeat and, with a last look at the bear, turned and disappeared into the forest. Its companions followed, their grey silhouettes dissolving into the dense vegetation. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the confrontation. The bear remained in its guard position for a few more moments, sniffing the air, ensuring that the threat had truly receded. Only then did it relax its tense muscles, letting out a heavy sigh that the woman could hear. It turned to her, its deep eyes examining her. She felt a wave of relief so intense that her legs trembled. It had won. It had protected her. Once again, it had defied death for her. The bear approached the bush, and with its muzzle, gently pushed aside the leaves, revealing the woman. It sniffed her, as if checking if she was unharmed. The woman stretched out her trembling hand and touched its fur, feeling the roughness and warmth of the creature that had saved her. There were no words to express the gratitude she felt. The journey, she knew, was far from over. The forest was a place of beauty and brutality, of life and death. But with the bear by her side, she was not alone. The improbable alliance had been tested, and it had prevailed. With each step, each danger overcome, the woman moved further from the world she knew, and closer to a deeper, wilder truth about survival and loyalty. The sun began to climb higher in the sky, and it was time to move on, to the next challenge, to the next dawn. The silence that followed the wolves' departure was almost more oppressive than the predator's growls. The forest seemed to have held its breath, and now released it in a slow, deep sigh. The woman, still hidden behind the bush, felt her entire body tremble, no longer from fear, but from overwhelming exhaustion. Her already weak legs barely supported her. The bear, her improbable guardian, remained for a few more moments in its defensive posture, sniffing the air with an almost palpable concentration, ensuring that the danger had truly dissipated. Only then did it relax, its massive muscles unwinding, and a heavy sigh escaped its throat, a sound that to the woman seemed like the relief of a giant. It turned to her, its deep eyes examining her with an intensity that seemed to see through her soul. There was no judgment, only an ancient curiosity and a silent concern. It approached the bush, and with its muzzle gently pushed aside the leaves, opening a path. The woman, trembling, dragged herself out, feeling the morning sun on her face, a cruel reminder of the passage of time and her own fragility. She stretched out her hand, still uncertain, and touched the bear's fur. It was rough, warm, and beneath the surface she could feel the vibration of a wild, powerful, and untamed life. There were no words to express the gratitude she felt, a gratitude that transcended language, communicating through touch and gaze. The bear turned, indicating the way, and she followed, each movement a torture for her injured leg. The pain was a constant, a hammer pounding on her bone, but now there was a purpose. The bear didn't rush her, allowing her to crawl. Leaning on trees and exposed roots, the sun climbed higher, filtering through the treetops, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves was constant, and the sound of insects and birds filled the air, a symphony of wildlife. But as the hours passed, the woman's weakness deepened. The wound on her leg, once merely painful, now radiated a feverish heat. She felt her head throb, her vision blurring at times. Dehydration and hunger began to take their toll, compounded by exhaustion and incipient infection. Each step was a monumental effort, and she found herself stumbling more often, her body heavy and devoid of energy. The bear, with its keen sensitivity, noticed the change. It stopped, turning its head to look at her. Its eyes, once vigilant, now seemed to carry a deeper concern. It growled softly, a sound that seemed like a question, an invitation for her to lean on it. The woman tried to smile, but her lips were cracked and dry. She shook her head, indicating that she needed to continue, that she couldn't stop. But the bear didn't move. Instead, it lowered itself slightly, and with its muzzle gently nudged her in a different direction, off the path they had been following. It was guiding her somewhere. The woman, too weak to resist, allowed herself to be led. The vegetation grew denser, and the air damper. She could hear the sound of running water, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. A faint hope ignited in her chest. Water. It was all she could think of. They reached a small stream, crystal clear water flowing over smooth stones. The bear stopped at the bank, looking at her. The woman, with a last effort, dragged herself to the edge, plunging her hands into the icy water and bringing it to her dry lips. The relief was immediate but brief. Thirst was deep, and water, by itself, wouldn't cure the fever now burning in her veins. As she drank, the bear sniffed the stream bank, and then with its claws began to dig near a clump of plants. It unearthed some roots and placed them before her. The woman looked at the roots, uncertain. Were they edible? Or would they be poisonous? She had no knowledge of the forest, not like the bear. But hunger was a powerful driver, and her trust in the animal had become absolute. She picked up one of the roots, cleaned it in the water, and took a hesitant bite. It had an earthy, slightly bitter taste, but it wasn't unpleasant. She ate more, feeling a small wave of energy, a breath of life in her exhausted body. But the fever didn't subside. On the contrary, it seemed to increase. The woman felt chills and hot flashes, and her vision began to fail again. She knew she was in real danger. The infection was spreading. She looked at the bear, her eyes pleading for help, for a miracle. The bear, as if understanding her anguish, licked her forehead, a strangely tender gesture that calmed her for a moment. It then stood up and with a low growl gently nudged her to lie down on a bed of soft moss near the stream. It lay down beside her, its massive body radiating comforting warmth. The woman closed her eyes, exhaustion and fever pulling her down. She felt the world spin, the trees blending into a green and brown blur. The last thing she felt was the bear's scent, the warmth of its body, and the sensation of security, however precarious. The forest, with its beauty and cruelty, continued its dance, and the woman, on her mossy bed, was at its mercy and that of her silent guardian. Night approached, bringing with it the cold and hidden dangers, and the woman was on the brink of the abyss, her life hanging by a thread. The alliance with the bear would be tested again, this time against an invisible and relentless enemy, death itself. Night descended upon the forest like a heavy, damp cloak, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold and an almost palpable darkness. For the woman, lying on the mossy bed, the outside world dissolved into a feverish haze. Trees writhed in dancing shadows, and the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant croak of a frog, the ominous hoot of an owl, transformed into menacing whispers, indistinct voices that seemed to mock her fragility. Her body was an oven, burning from within, while uncontrollable shivers racked her. The wound on her leg pulsed with a dull, constant ache, a drum beating to her rhythm of agony. Her mind, once so lucid in its despair, now floated in a sea of delirium. Fragmented images of her son appeared and vanished, his face distorted, his eyes empty as they were when he abandoned her. The irony was a bitter poison. The son of her flesh had left her to die, while a wild animal, a predator of the forest, fought to keep her alive. The bear, her silent guardian, remained by her side. Its massive body was a barrier against the cold and the invisible dangers of the night. She could feel the warmth emanating from it, an anchor amidst the storm of her fever. From time to time, it moved, sniffing the air, its low growls the only melody in her darkness. It was the only real thing, the only certainty in a disintegrating world. Hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of suffering. The woman coughed, a dry, painful cough that tore at her throat. She tried to move, but her muscles were stiff, her limbs heavy as lead. Thirst was insatiable, a grit that scratched her mouth and throat. In a fleeting moment of lucidity, she tried to crawl to the stream, but strength abandoned her, and she fell back onto the moss, moaning. The bear, sensing her agitation, approached. With its muzzle, it gently nudged her as if inviting her to snuggle closer. It lay down, and she, in her semi-conscious state, felt its thick, warm fur against her face. It was a primitive animal comfort, yet it enveloped her with a sense of security that no human words could have provided. It was her protection, her shield against imminent death. The fever climbed even higher, and the woman began to babble, nonsensical words escaping her cracked lips. She saw figures dancing in the shadows, heard voices calling her name, voices that mingled with the distant howl of a coyote, fear mixed with confusion. Was she dying? Was this how it ended, abandoned, sick, at the mercy of wild nature? But then a different sound, a low, guttural growl from the bear. It wasn't a sound of comfort, but of alert. The woman, even in her stupor, felt the change in the animal's body tension. It stood up, its muscles contracting, its eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the stream. There was something out there, something the bear sensed, something the forest hid in its deepest shadows. The bear remained motionless, a statue of strength and vigilance. The woman, with superhuman effort, opened her eyes. She couldn't see anything, but the sensation of danger was palpable, an icy shiver that made her momentarily forget the burning fever. The bear was her only warning, her only sentinel. It was ready to fight again, to risk everything for her, a creature it barely knew, but to whom it had sworn loyalty. The night seemed to stretch infinitely, a test of endurance against disease and hidden predators. The bear let out another growl, stronger this time, and the woman heard a hurried rustle in the vegetation, the sound of something moving away. The danger had been repelled once again by the bear's mere presence and determination, but the victory was only momentary. The fever continued to consume the woman, stealing her strength and consciousness. She felt her body failing, her breathing becoming shallow and irregular. The bear lay down beside her again, and this time it gently licked her forehead, a gesture that seemed like a desperate attempt to alleviate her suffering. The woman closed her eyes, exhausted, feeling herself drain away. She was on the brink of the abyss, her life hanging by a thread so tenuous it could barely be seen. The forest, with its indifferent beauty and relentless cruelty, watched. The bear, her improbable guardian, was the only thing that kept her connected to this world. Night advanced, and with it, the final battle against death approached, a battle she, alone, had no hope of winning. Night stretched on, a suffocating shroud over the forest, and for the woman, reality dissolved into increasingly distant fragments. The fever was a wildfire, consuming her from within, and each beat of her heart seemed to echo the drum of death, a slow and inexorable rhythm. She was no longer just sick, she was on the verge of dissolution, her body and mind in a desperate struggle against the abyss. Her body, once a temple of pain, was now a battlefield where life and death waged their most brutal war. Convulsive shivers racked her, followed by waves of heat so intense she felt her skin burn as if she were being consumed by flames. The wound on her leg, once a localized pain, now was an epicenter of agony radiating throughout her being, a spreading poison, corroding her last defenses. Her mind, her mind. It was a whirlwind of distorted images and sounds, a kaleidoscope of memories and fears. Her son's face, who had abandoned her, appeared and vanished. But now it was not with anger, but with a deep sadness, an incomprehension of the abyss of cruelty he had revealed. How could the flesh of her flesh be so cold, so indifferent, while the wild beast was so warm, so loyal? The irony was a poison even more bitter than the infection in her veins. She saw the stream transforming into a river of blood, the trees dancing like menacing specters, and the sky, even through the dense canopy, seemed to spin in dark, endless spirals. The bear, her silent guardian, was the only anchor in her sea of delirium. She could feel its massive warmth, a living furnace against the relentless cold of the night that tried to steal her last breath of life. The smell of earth and wild animal, once strange and intimidating, was now the aroma of safety, of unwavering loyalty. From time to time, she felt the bear's deep breath in her hair or the gentle touch of its muzzle, a constant reminder that she was not alone, even when her own consciousness abandoned her. She babbled words, perhaps her son's name, perhaps a forgotten prayer, perhaps just groans of pain that were lost in the night's silence. Her throat was dry, raw, and thirst was a constant torture, a grit that choked her. But the strength to crawl to the stream had completely vanished. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own body at the mercy of fever and fading time. The bear, with its instinctive wisdom, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. It did not move away. Its eyes, even in the darkness, were beacons of vigilance, sweeping the forest, listening to the whispers of the wind, the distant snapping of branches, the sounds that the woman in her stupor could no longer discern. It was the unbreakable barrier between her and the dangers that night brought, the predators that might be drawn by the scent of blood or imminent weakness. In a moment of terrifying clarity, the woman opened her eyes. The world still spun, but for an instant she saw the bear. It lay near her, but its head was raised, its eyes fixed on a point in the darkness. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in its chest, a sound she had learned to recognize as a warning, a premonition of danger. There was something out there again, something the bear sensed, something the forest hid in its deepest shadows. Fear, which the fever had suppressed, returned with full force. It wasn't the fear of death, but the fear that the bear, her last link to life, might be harmed. She tried to move, tried to warn it, but only a weak, inaudible moan escaped her cracked lips. She was useless, a burden, and guilt struck her like lightning. The bear slowly stood up, its muscles tense, every fiber of its being on high alert. It positioned itself between the woman and the direction of the danger, its massive body an impenetrable fortress. The woman couldn't see what it was, but she could feel the presence, a shadow lurking in the depths of the forest, drawn by vulnerability, by the promise of easy prey. The air grew heavy, charged with a primal tension. The bear let out a deeper growl, an unmistakable warning that echoed through the forest, a challenge, a declaration of possession. The woman heard a hurried rustle, the sound of something large and heavy moving quickly through the dense vegetation, retreating, moving away from the territory protected by the bear. The danger had been repelled again by the animal's mere presence and determination. But the victory was hollow. The fever continued its relentless march. The woman felt a new wave of weakness, a sensation of emptiness, as if her very essence were being drained. Her breathing became shallower, more irregular, a faint whisper that barely moved her chest. She was fading. The bear lay down beside her again, and this time it didn't just lick her forehead. With its muzzle, it gently nudged her, nestling her deeper into its thick, warm fur. It then began to lick the wound on her leg, with surprising delicacy for such a large animal. The bear's saliva, though not a remedy, was a strange balm, cleaning the dirt and perhaps offering temporary relief for the pulsing pain, a primitive antisepsis that the forest offered. The woman felt a warmth spread through the wound, not the heat of the fever, but a different, almost healing warmth, a sensation of care and protection so profound that it transcended the barrier between species. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her temples, mixing with sweat and dirt. She was dying, she knew, but she was not alone. The bear was her guardian angel, her last and most faithful companion. It was fighting for her, not with claws and teeth against a visible enemy, but with its presence, its warmth, its unwavering loyalty against the invisible death that consumed her. The night seemed eternal, a dark and cold tunnel. The woman felt her consciousness fragmenting further, her thoughts becoming indistinct blurs. She was falling into a bottomless abyss, but there was always the bear's warmth, its scent, the sensation of its massive presence, pulling her back, a tenuous thread connecting her to life. The bear, with its infinite patience, continued its vigil. It growled softly from time to time, a sound that seemed like a strange lullaby, a promise that it wouldn't leave her. The forest, with all its dangers, seemed to calm around them, respecting the strange alliance that had formed. As the first pale lights of dawn began to peek through the treetops, tinting the sky a ghostly blue-gray, the woman was in a state of near coma. Her breathing was a faint whisper, her pulse barely perceptible. The fever had reached its peak, and now she was on the brink of the final precipice. The bear, however, had not given up. It was there, its body still a barrier, its eyes still vigilant, waiting, watching, fighting against the darkness that threatened to swallow her forever. The battle had not ended, but the woman was rapidly losing ground, and the bear, alone, no longer had a way to fight against the invisible enemy that consumed her. Hope, so tenuous, was almost extinguishing, hanging by a thread as fragile as her own life. The first lights of dawn brought no relief, only a cruel clarity to the shroud that stretched over the forest. The sky, tinted a ghostly blue-gray, seemed to weep tears of dew over the damp leaves, but for the woman it was merely confirmation that another night had passed, and with it, life was draining away. She was in a state of near coma, her breathing a faint whisper, her pulse barely perceptible, a distant drum threatening to silence at any moment. The fever had reached its peak, a private hell consuming her from within, and now she was on the brink of the final precipice, where time and pain dissolved into a formless void. The bear, however, had not given up. It was the unshakable rock amidst the storm of her agony, its body still a massive barrier, its eyes still vigilant, swept the forest, no longer searching for visible predators, but as if it could see the invisible enemy that consumed her. It waited, watched, fought against the darkness that threatened to swallow her forever. The battle had not ended, but the woman was rapidly losing ground, and the bear alone no longer had a way to fight against the disease that corroded her essence. In her stupor, the woman felt the subtle changes in the environment. The pre-dawn cold slowly yielded to a faint warmth, but it was not the warmth of returning life, but the heat of the rising sun, indifferent to her struggle. She heard the first songs of the birds, a distant chorus that once would have been a sign of hope, but now seemed like a funeral lament, a farewell to the world she was about to leave. Her mind, a broken mosaic of memories and sensations, floated between past and present, between reality and delirium. She saw her son's face again, but this time there was no anger, not even bitter sadness. There was only a strange acceptance, an understanding that the abyss between them was insurmountable, a wound deeper than any cut in her flesh. The irony was overwhelming. The son of her blood had abandoned her to death, while the wild beast, the predator by nature, protected her with a loyalty that defied all logic. It was an inverted mirror of humanity, where savagery revealed a compassion that civilization had forgotten. The bear, sensing the woman's extreme fragility, moved with surprising delicacy. It nudged her again with its muzzle, nestling her even closer, as if wanting to infuse her with its own vital force. The warmth of its fur was the only refuge against the cold that threatened to freeze her soul. It continued to lick the wound on her leg with an almost ritualistic persistence. The saliva, once just a strange balm, now seemed to have a deeper purpose, a desperate attempt to purify what was corrupted, to ward off the spreading infection. In a brief and terrifying moment of lucidity, the woman opened her eyes. The world no longer spun in chaotic spirals. She saw the bear, its enormous furry face so close to hers, its amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to transcend animal understanding. There was no ferocity, only a deep concern, a silent sadness. In that instant, she knew. It was saying goodbye. Or perhaps it was just watching the last breath of life drain away. A solitary tear streamed from her eye, tracing a clean path through the dirt and sweat on her temple. It wasn't a tear of pain nor of fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. She extended a trembling hand with a strength she didn't know she still possessed, and touched the bear's rough fur. It was a weak, almost imperceptible touch, but the bear felt it. It stopped licking the wound and tilted its head, allowing the contact. In that moment, the barrier between species dissolved, and all that remained was the pure connection between two living beings, one who gave, one who received. The woman closed her eyes again, her hand still resting on the bear's fur. Her breathing became even shallower, a tenuous thread stretching to its limit. She felt her body shutting down limb by limb, sense by sense. The scent of the forest, the warmth of the bear, the distant sounds, everything began to recede, to become a distant echo. She was falling again, but this time there was no fear of the abyss. There was a strange peace, an acceptance. The bear let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to carry all its anguish and helplessness. It knew, it felt life draining from her. It nudged her once more with its muzzle, with an urgency it hadn't shown before, as if it could, with its own will, pull her back from the threshold of death. It licked her face, her hair, as if trying to revive her, as if its saliva could be the water of life she so desperately needed. But it was too late. The woman's body trembled one last time, an almost imperceptible spasm. Her breathing ceased, her pulse silenced. The hand that rested on the bear's fur fell inert. The forest, for a brief moment, seemed to hold its breath in a reverent silence. The morning sun, finally breaking through the treetops, cast golden rays upon the scene, illuminating the motionless woman and the bear, her faithful guardian, who now lay beside a lifeless body. The bear remained there, motionless, for a long time. Its eyes, once vigilant, now seemed lost, fixed on emptiness. It had fought, it had protected, it had loved in its own wild way, but death, the invisible enemy, had won. The hope it had tried to keep alive with its presence and warmth had finally extinguished. The forest, with its indifferent beauty and relentless cruelty, had claimed another soul, and the bear, its improbable guardian, was now the sole witness to a loyalty that transcended life and death. It let out a deep lament, a guttural sound that echoed through the forest, a cry of pain and loss that nature rarely heard. The bear's lament, a sound that tore through the quiet of the morning forest, was not a roar of fury, but a primal echo of loss. It was the voice of nature weeping for a soul that humanity had abandoned, but which savagery had embraced. The sound dissipated into the trees, leaving behind an even heavier silence, an emptiness that seemed to swallow the golden light now filtering through the canopy. The bear remained there, massive and motionless, beside the woman's body. Its amber eyes, once filled with protective vigilance, now carried a melancholic depth, as if it understood the irreversibility of what had happened. It nudged her again with its muzzle, a last instinctive attempt to awaken what could no longer be roused. The body, once warm and vibrant, was now cold and stiff, an empty shell of the life it had so desperately tried to preserve. The scent of blood, once an alert of danger and pain, now mingled with the smell of damp earth and death, an aroma the forest knew well. It let out a low growl, almost a sigh, and lay down again, no longer nestling her with the same urgency, but like a guardian refusing to abandon its post, even if the treasure it protected no longer held its shine. Its forepaw, once used to ward off invisible predators, now rested gently on the woman's shoulder, a gesture of possession and farewell. The sun climbed higher, painting the forest with emerald green and gold hues, but the scene beneath the tree remained in a somber half-light, a sanctuary of mourning and loyalty. Hours dragged on, marked only by the shifting light and the distant sounds of the forest slowly resuming its routine. Birds sang, insects buzzed, and the wind whispered through the leaves, indifferent to the unfolding tragedy. The bear did not move. Its presence was an anchor in the landscape, a living statue of devotion. It watched, not with the same intensity as before, but with a stillness that seemed to absorb the very essence of the forest. There was no hunger, no thirst, only the vigil. The woman, in her shroud of earth and leaves, lay in peace, finally free from pain and abandonment. But the forest, though a refuge, was not an eternal secret. The scent of death, however subtle, began to spread, a silent message to the other inhabitants of the wild kingdom. Flies began to buzz, drawn by the inevitability of the end. The bear, with a slow, deliberate movement of its head, swatted them away with a snort, maintaining the integrity of its improvised sanctuary. It was there to protect not just life, but also the dignity of death. As midday approached, a new sound, strange and dissonant, began to pierce the quiet of the forest. It was a distant yet persistent noise that did not belong to the natural chorus of songs and whispers. An engine, first faint and indistinct, then gradually louder, closer. The bear raised its head, its ears twitching, catching the vibration through the ground and the air. Its amber eyes, once veiled by sadness, now narrowed with a new vigilance, a spark of alert. The sound was unmistakable, the engine of a vehicle, perhaps a car or a truck, struggling against the irregularities of the dirt road that passed not far away. The same road that had brought the woman to the brink of death, and that now threatened to bring the world of men to her final resting place. The bear growled, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in its chest. Its massive body tensed, the muscles beneath its thick fur contracting. It would not flee. It had made a silent promise, an alliance that transcended life and death. It was there to stay, to defend what had become its own. The forest, which had witnessed abandonment and compassion, now prepared to witness the confrontation between wild loyalty and human intrusion. The tension was palpable, a stretched rope about to snap. The scent of the men arrived first, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and something metallic, strange and invasive. The bear sniffed the air, its nostrils flared, processing every molecule that announced their approach. Its eyes, now fully focused, swept the tree line, searching for the origin of the threat. It could hear the rustle of dry leaves, the snap of branches under heavy boots. These were not the light, stealthy steps of a forest predator, but the deliberate, noisy march of beings who considered themselves masters of the terrain. The voices grew more distinct, fragments of phrases floating through the air. Over here. The trail. Couldn't have gone far. The bear didn't understand the words, but the intention was clear. They were searching, and what they would find, it would not allow to be touched. It positioned itself not directly over the body, but slightly in front, its imposing mass forming a barrier. Its claws, sharp as daggers, were ready. Its teeth, capable of crushing bones, were a silent promise of retribution. The forest, once a sanctuary, transformed into a battlefield. The birds, which had been singing, fell silent, sensing the change in atmosphere. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then they appeared. Two men, dressed in hunting gear, with backpacks and rifles slung over their shoulders. Their faces were tense, marked by worry and exhaustion. They emerged from among the trees, their eyes sweeping the ground for clues, until suddenly one of them raised his head. His gaze froze. The other man, following the direction of his companion's look, also stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the accelerated beating of the men's hearts and the low, continuous growl emanating from the bear's chest. They saw the scene. The motionless body of the woman, wrapped in a shroud of leaves and earth, and the gigantic bear, which rose over her like a furry mountain, its amber eyes fixed on them with an intensity that promised death. The first man instinctively raised his rifle, but his movement was slow, hesitant. There was something in the bear's posture, in its fierce stillness, that prevented him from acting. It wasn't just a wild animal, it was a guardian, and the scene unfolding before them was of a terrible and incomprehensible beauty. The second man, paler than the first, whispered, his voice choked with fear, "My God, what is this?" The bear took a step forward, a slow, calculated movement that made the earth tremble. A deep, guttural growl escaped its throat, an unmistakable warning. It was not attacking, but it was making it clear that it would not retreat. Its body was a fortress, its presence an insurmountable wall. The men, trained for hunting, for dominating nature, found themselves before something that defied all their understanding. It was not prey, nor a common predator. It was the personification of loyalty, pain, and wild fury. The first man, his hand still on the rifle, swallowed hard. He could smell death, yes, but also the scent of protection, of devotion. He saw the bear's paw resting gently on the woman's shoulder, a gesture of tenderness that contrasted brutally with the ferocity of its posture. That bear was not there to feed, but to protect what had become its own, even in death. One of the men began to retreat slowly, one step at a time, without taking his eyes off the bear. The other, still paralyzed, seemed to struggle against disbelief. What should they do? Shoot? Flee? The forest, which had once seemed a familiar place, now became a stage for a primordial confrontation where human reason clashed with wild emotion. The bear, imposing and unshakable, waited. The tension was a sharp blade suspended in the air, ready to cut at any moment. The sharp blade of tension hung, but did not cut. The men, hunters by trade, accustomed to deciphering the forest's signs and imposing their will upon it, were now paralyzed. Their rifles, extensions of their power and reason, seemed heavy and useless in their hands. It was not a hungry predator facing them, nor a furious beast defending its offspring. It was something more primal, more pure, loyalty incarnate, a silent promise that transcended human understanding. The first man, who had instinctively raised his rifle, felt cold sweat trickle down his neck. His eyes, trained to aim and shoot, were fixed on the bear's amber eyes, and what he saw was not blind savagery, but an unbreakable determination, a deep sadness. The animal's paw, still resting on the woman's shoulder, was a seal, a declaration of possession that could not be challenged by brute force. It was a gesture of tenderness that disarmed any intention of violence. The second man, even paler, finally found his voice, not to shout or threaten, but to whisper, almost to himself, "No, it's not an attack. He's protecting her." The realization, slow and painful, began to sink in. They had come searching for a missing woman, perhaps the same woman whose son had abandoned her to her fate, and now they found her, not rescued by her own kind, but guarded by a creature humanity considered wild and irrational. The bear let out another low growl, a sound that wasn't menacing, but a warning, a reminder of its presence and purpose. Its muscles, once tense for confrontation, relaxed slightly, but its posture remained that of a guardian. It wasn't there to fight for territory or food, but for an invisible bond it had forged in pain and solitude. The first man, the more experienced one, slowly lowered his rifle. The soft click of metal was the only sound to break the heavy silence. He looked at the woman's body, at the makeshift shroud of leaves and earth, at the peace she had finally found. And then he looked at the bear again. In that moment, he understood the depth of the tragedy and the magnitude of compassion. The sun had turned his back, but the forest, through its most imposing inhabitant, had embraced the abandoned soul. "We can't," he began, his voice hoarse. "We can't touch her." The second man nodded, still trembling, but with a new understanding in his eyes. The scene before them was sacred, profane by its very existence, yet sanctified by the bear's devotion. It was a testament to human failure and wild redemption. Slowly, with a reverence they would never have imagined feeling before a wild animal, the two men began to retreat. Their steps were cautious, not just from fear of the bear, but from the respect the scene inspired. They moved away from the clearing, from the shadow of the tree where the woman and her guardian rested. The bear watched them, its amber eyes following every movement, until they disappeared among the trees. It did not pursue them. Its vigil was not about domination, but about protection. The sound of the men's footsteps faded, then disappeared completely. The vehicle's engine started again, a distant rumble that soon vanished into the vastness of the forest. Silence returned, deeper and more meaningful than before. The bear let out a sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire forest. It lay down beside the woman again, its paw still on her shoulder. The sun, now at its zenith, filtered through the treetops, painting the scene with a golden glow, as if nature itself were blessing that improvised sanctuary. The flies, which had been buzzing, were again swatted away by a gentle snort from the bear. It was there to protect, to maintain the dignity of death, to honor the life it had tried to save. It didn't know what a son was, or what abandonment was, but it knew what a commitment was. Hours turned into an eternity. The forest, which had witnessed the beginning and the end, continued its undisturbed cycle. Birds sang again, the wind whispered secrets among the leaves, and the river, not far away, continued its course. But beneath the tree, the scene remained unchanged, the woman's body at peace, and the bear, her eternal guardian. It would not abandon her, not as her son had. It would stay there, a mountain of fur and loyalty, until the forest, in its infinite wisdom, reclaimed what was its own. The story of the abandoned woman and the compassionate bear became a whisper among the trees, a silent legend that spoke of human cruelty and the unwavering kindness of nature. And in that place, where life and death met under the shadow of a wild promise, the bear's loyalty became the purest and truest epitaph for a soul that, in the end, found its refuge not in the arms of a man, but in the untamed heart of the forest.